So let's say you're in the market for your first motorcycle, or you haven't been on a motorcycle in a few years and you want to get back on one, but you want one that's relatively easy to handle and easy to ride. Well, you can't go wrong with the Honda Shadow, but with so many variations and forms of the bike, which one do you choose? Today, on my left, I have a 2000 Honda Shadow 600, and on my right, if you've seen the previous video before, is my personal bike, my 1985 Honda Shadow 500. And we're gonna compare and contrast and see which is the better choice for you. Every biker knows about the Honda Shadow. It's that popular. Honda started finding success in racing in the 1980s, but the gold-winged Japanese manufacturer wanted to prove itself elsewhere, the open American roads of freedom. This small Japanese cruiser bike was launched in 1983, along with many other Japanese cruiser bikes vying to win the cruiser segment, ruled by Harley-Davidson. The Shadow has evolved into many variations over the years, and here we see where it starts, with the red 1985 VT500C and the 2000 Shadow 600. These bikes both carry the Shadow moniker, but are separated by 15 years. These bikes, however, only have their name in common. The 1985 Shadow is powered by a 491cc 52-degree 4-stroke V-twin with 3 valves per cylinder, a 10.5:1 compression ratio, and a bore of 71mm by 62mm. It made a claimed 50 horsepower at 9,000 RPMs and 31 pound-feet of torque at 7,000 RPMs. A bit of a screamer the old bike is then. The 85 is shaft-driven, has a single disc up front and a drum in rear, and has a close ratio 6-speed gearbox with a claimed top speed of 99 miles an hour. The 2000 Shadow 600 VLX also comes equipped with a 4-stroke 52-degree V-twin with 583 cc's of displacement. However, this engine is more relaxed than its 15-year-old sibling. The bore has been changed to 76.2mm by 66mm. The compression ratio has been lowered to 9.2 to 1, and the bike makes 39 horsepower at 6,500 RPMs and 36 pound-feet of torque at 3,300 RPMs. A much more balanced engine this bike has then. The 600 is also chain-driven with a 4-speed wide ratio gearbox, they claim top speed of around 90 miles an hour. It also contains a single disc up front and a single drum in the back as well. Now, I've already given a lot of my thoughts on how the 1985 motorcycle rides. I will link that video below, but to get a better idea before we take both of these bikes out on the road on how the 2000 Shadow rides, I decided to ask the owners some questions. I've borrowed this bike from my good friend Sho. Sho, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Say what's up to the viewers.
Hello, hello.
Now this is it's a nice clean bike you've got. Why don't you tell the viewers a little bit about your bike here?
Yeah, I have a 2000 Honda Shadow 600. It's actually got 583 cc's to be exact. It's smooth, little nice ride, especially like long distance. Don't hurt my back. Like a lot of other like street bikes and stuff.
Okay. Now, this is your first bike, correct?
Yes, it is.
And would you recommend for a beginner rider this sort of motorcycle, or someone who's been off of a motorcycle for a few years and they maybe wanted to come back on? Would you recommend they get one of these bikes?
Yeah, I would recommend this bike or Honda Shadows in general. Especially because it's a 600, it's not as big, not as hard to move like 1100 or 1800, so it's really easy to ride.
Okay, and the last question I have for you is, what made you choose a Honda Shadow over competitors like maybe a Yamaha Virago or a Harley-Davidson Sportster?
The first thing I looked at was I'm short. So my feet reach when I ride this bike with no issue, especially at like stoplights, stuff like that. It was a lot more comfortable for me. It was a lot smoother of a ride, in my personal opinion. So that's what made me choose this bike.
All right, cool. Thanks, Sho. Let's get to riding. Because I had never been on the 600 before, I decided that I was going to take that one out on the open road first. I immediately noticed the ergonomics were quite user-friendly. The handlebars are placed at a distance where you are stretched out to a comfortable position, and the distance between the foot pegs are set up to feel a bit like a lazy boar recliner. It was immediately clear to me that Honda wanted the 600 VLX riders to be comfortable so that the bike could be taken on long distance rides. With a seat height of 26.7 inches or 680 millimeters, standing this bike up requires absolutely no effort at all. It is very easy to flat foot, and I found that my back felt quite relaxed. There was little to no strain. Another crucial step taken to attract the cruiser market was re-engineering the sound of the bike. The 600 VLX sounds more like a traditional rumbling V-twin. Take a listen. It sounds as if Gurren Lagann's Kamina is drilling a hole from underneath the telegraph, and I didn't expect a 600cc V-twin to have this much character in its sound. The low-end torque is readily available, however, this bike feels a bit sluggish to get up to speed. You can thank the 4-speed wide ratio transmission for that. I'd assume that the long ratios are there to aid in fuel economy and keep the vibrations to a minimum, and vibrates a lot this bike does, so much to the point that you might mistake it for a big twin. For me though, it adds a bit of charm to the Shadow 600's character. I can see how it could be bothersome to some riders, however. You can expect around 40 mpgs while on this bike. It contains a 3-gallon tank, so when filled up you can expect around 120 miles in range. I did enjoy the overall accessibility of this bike. It is so easy to ride that you could control it by using the force. However, my biggest issue with this bike is the stiffness. Honda went through the trouble of making the ergonomics so relaxed and so comfortable, so why does this bike ride so stiff? I blame the monoshock swing arm on the rear. It does absolutely nothing for the ride quality, and when I went over some of the more pronounced bumps, I forgot about the comfortable riding position because the rear suspension was too busy knocking my very soul into the Earth's orbit. Now, with everything that I just mentioned in mind, I decided it was time to get back onto the 1985 Shadow and see how it compared to its 15-year younger sibling. Immediately, I noticed how much higher I was off the ground, not just because of the 30.3-inch seat height, but the foot pegs are moved further back as well, giving you a more neutral riding position compared to the relaxed cruiser style on the 600 VLX. The seating position overall isn't quite as comfortable as the newer motorcycle, and I also found it more difficult to flat foot while at stoplights. The suspension, on the other hand, was much more supple and compliant with the road. It made for a much smoother riding experience. Smooth is a great way to describe the older bike. There are less vibrations from the engine, and with the close ratio 6-speed, shifting felt smooth as well. Despite the smoothness, this bike isn't as relaxing to ride. It seems a bit at odds with itself. Here's what I mean. The engine in this bike feels like it belongs in a sport bike or a standard bike, and if I'm honest, the 85 Shadow feels like a standard bike, not at all like a cruiser. That's because the engine and transmission are indeed borrowed from the Honda Ascot, which is indeed a naked bike. When dumping the gas at the light, the VT500 can lift at the front wheel off the ground thanks to the closer gear ratios and the shorter wheelbase. The engine has a lot more pep and will rev up to 9,500 RPMs without breaking a sweat, though it doesn't have the same shouty charm as its younger sibling. Take a listen. I felt more scrunched up on the VT500, my legs felt closer together, and overall the riding position feels more cramped, so it's not as comfortable on longer rides despite the softer springs and smoother engine and transmission. That's not necessarily a bad thing to some. Here's what I mean. With the more neutral ergonomics and lighter weight, the VT500 is tossable and much more agile than its younger sibling, but because of the softer suspension, you have to keep up with it a bit more when the bike is pushed through the corners. It actually makes the VT500 more engaging to ride in my opinion. Think about it like a Mazda Miata in that sense. The brakes are not as good as the 600 VLX, so if you plan on more spirited riding, which, let's be honest, you probably will because of how agile the bike is, I'd invest in better pads and go for a cross-drilled rotor like the one installed on the 600. The VT500C also has a 3-gallon tank, but the average MPGs are a bit higher with a claimed 50 MPGs. I say claimed, however, because I average between 42 and 45 MPGs. So, these two bikes are both called a Honda Shadow, however they have almost nothing in common. What we have here then is a comparison test not between two cruisers, but a comparison test between a classic 34-year-old naked bike and a 19-year-old laid-back cruiser, and after riding these two bikes back to back, here are the major impressions that they left behind. The 2600 VLX is an all-out cruiser. It's most enjoyable cruising down the boulevard or country back roads, taking in the sights. This bike excels when it is not pushed to its limits, and even though the springs are stiff, the riding position is comfortable over long distances. The VLX 600 is a true American-inspired denim and cowboy boots wearing cruiser. The 1985 VT500C is the mutts of the motorcycle world. Honda gave it a cruiser body style, but the engine and transmission have been borrowed from the Ascot, and that gives the VT500C a behavior more akin to a naked bike, and that's really what it is in my opinion. A naked bike, not dressed up in its workout gear, but a form-fitting dress. It's quite tossable and a lot of fun in the twisties, and it's backed up by that 6-speed gearbox and 9,500 RPM redline. I find it interesting how even though the Shadow started off as a bit of a Frankenstein offering in the cruiser market, the demand of cruiser buyers in America shaped the Shadow over time into a more traditional styled bike, and to be honest, that kind of makes me sad. The older bike has a much more unique vibe to it, and I think that's why it stands out to me. As for which one you should get, well, here's what I'll say. If you want an easy-to-use, relaxed, comfortable, no fuss, no worries bike, the VLX 600 is for you. If you'd like a more unique offering, something that is not seen quite as often, and that is a bit more energetic, then get the VT500C. That's the one I prefer, but hey, to each their own, right?